We're so happy that you could join us this evening. This is an event which is distinguished by the fact that it is a part of our 50th anniversary celebration of the foundation year program, which had its first lectures in September 1972. I don't think that a long introduction of Neil Robertson is necessary, but just to remind you that Neil has been a foundational figure in the foundation year program and has distinguished himself there by being a coordinator of every single section of the 6 that we do annually, and therefore, of course, has also lectured in every section. He's now a full professor, and also, it should be added, a member of the Early Modern Studies program and the Contemporary Studies program. But a particular interest is that he is the chair of the board of Halifax Humanities, which is a kind of attempt to bring together this knowledge that we try to convey to our students to a much more diverse and dispersed audience of individuals who might otherwise not have any university education. I'd also like to mention that Kimberly and Mark and Paul are with us, and without them, there would be no virtual book club. So thank you so much for being here. In 1949, Leo Strauss became a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. And we are here this evening celebrating Neil's book on Leo Strauss, an introduction to his thought, which has been published by the very distinguished Polity Press. We're very happy to have it as a monument, but also as a resource, because as we'll be making clear, Leo Strauss has important things to tell us about political philosophy, but also about the foundation year program. In 1949, Leo Strauss became a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, where he remained until 1969, and where, I believe, Strauss founded a school of thought whose influence has scarcely diminished to this day. So I'm going to ask Neil to say a few words about the fact that the name of Leo Strauss is associated closely with Great Books programs, and that we ourselves are sometimes referred to in that way. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't agree, but perhaps you could just say what Leo Strauss's role is in the Great Books program, of which we are at least a satellite.
Thank you, Tom. And it's a real pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk about Leo Strauss, who I think is a figure who's less well known to our contemporary world than some of the other figures that are often mentioned in the same context, Heidegger and Husserl and Derrida and so on and so forth. But Strauss represents a crucial form of contemporary thought and is often a highly controversial figure. He's often associated with the conservative side of American political thought. And at the University of Chicago, he had a crucial role in developing a school of thinkers, so that a number of his students then went on to teach in a number of the top universities in the United States, at Harvard, at Yale, at St. John's College in Annapolis, in a whole variety of the University of Chicago itself is a kind of particular center, the University of Toronto. And at Dalhousie University, when I came here as a student, there was a Straussian professor teaching in the political science department, and he had an enormous influence, for instance, on the great conservative Canadian thinker George Grant, who taught here at the University of King's College when I was a student here. So his influence, particularly in education, has been huge. And a number of his students have been inspired by Strauss's own approach to political thought to be involved in Great Books programs. So the University of Chicago is itself one of the great centers of a great books approach, and various other places such as St. John's College in Annapolis, which is perhaps the most exclusively great books university in the world, or at least in the United States, where they have a 4-year program. And Strauss's great friend Jacob Klein taught there. So Strauss's approach is a really important one, and a deeply influential one. And in some sense, the foundation year program is engaged in the same basic exercise. But it's important to distinguish the basic approaches of the two. In Leo Strauss's view, and in that of his students, one way of characterizing the contemporary world is that it's an era of nihilism, an era in which a human sense of what is good and excellent has been lost sight of. As Strauss puts it, our sense of the eternal has been diminished. And so from that point of view, there's a kind of loss of depth, particularly a depth within the human. And so one of Strauss's students, Alan Bloom, wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind, which was meant to capture the sense of a kind of cultural loss and spiritual loss and intellectual loss that had been at work in the modern world, and had its form particularly being realized in Bloom's mind in the America of the late 20th century, and for many of the Straussians continuing on into the 21st century. And so the remedy for that sense of the flattened soul, of the diminished humanity that the Straussian analysis made primary, is to awaken a sense that what the great books can do is give access to depths, to spiritual and intellectual and philosophical resources that we don't have present in our own world. And so from that point of view, there's a sense that we have a kind of empty soul that is then given access to this knowledge, this truth that is available and recoverable through great books. So when you go and read Plato, or you go and read Homer, or you engage with the Bible, there are ways in which those deeper human truths are being made present to us. And so the role of the professor is in some ways to be the person who unlocks that treasure house for the students. And that can be an enormously exhilarating experience for students to encounter that sense of things. But I think the foundation year program engages in a very different exercise. So in a way, we read almost an identical list of books. We engage in very similar pedagogical practices, and particularly the use of tutorials to unearth these works. But the ethos and purpose, I think, has a completely reversed view. My take on the standpoint that the foundation program tends to inhabit, and of course there's lots of controversy here, we disagree among ourselves, but would be not that we have empty souls, but in fact that we have full souls, that there's a whole development within us. The difficulty is that we often don't know how to access those inner resources to understand what is at work in our own contemporary standpoint. And so what we're doing is giving people, giving our students, giving ourselves a way to articulate and understand what is at work within us already. Our souls are already full. And that, so the task of the foundation program is to look at these texts, not because they have hidden resources, but because they give us access to our own hidden or inarticulate depths.
Well, we've discussed this many times, but I'll just reiterate it now, that since the foundation program was inaugurated, we have had loads of connections between King's and St. John's Annapolis. And that's very important because when Leo Strauss retired from the University of Chicago, he became a distinguished scholar in residence at St. John's College, Annapolis in 1970, so almost the same period until his death in October 1973. And we have recruited tutors who were trained in that great books tradition. And also we have former FY2P tutors who have now established themselves both at St. John's Annapolis and its sister campus, St. John's Santa Fe. So what I'm going to say to you, I hope is correct, which is from the very beginning, there has been a conversation or a dialogue going on with Leo Strauss. And this is the only chance I'm going to have to correct you in the whole evening. So I'm going to take it because you said that a number of students became influential. We're talking about scores, if not hundreds, possibly of professors and academics who have been
Oh, yes.
deeply, deeply formed by him. And we, I believe, in Foundation Year program have resisted the Straussian interpretation. Is that fair?
Oh, yes, I would say that, you're right. There's certainly been conversation, interaction, and we have had those who have who have been influenced by Strauss have taught in the program, and people who have taught in the program who've gone on to programs which are shaped around the Straussian approach to the Western tradition. But I think that is right, that the character of the Foundation Year program is in tension with the character of how a Straussian approach to text. And one way of bringing that out is that for Leo Strauss, the great problem of the contemporary world can be captured in a single word, and that's the word historicism. And historicism is the claim that works of thought, that really all forms of human knowing and being, are fundamentally shaped and perhaps in part determined by their historical context, by the history in which out of which they emerge. The fundamental claim of Leo Strauss is that historicism and historical consciousness is at the very heart of what I'm talking about, this kind of crisis of the contemporary, the age of nihilism, the loss of meaning. And so for Strauss, historicism is precisely what his philosophical standpoint is meant to liberate us from. And so the interest of the Straussian approach to text is to be able to attain to a standpoint in some ways free or beyond history, what Strauss calls the recovery of nature, and ask fundamental questions that are, in a crucial sense, beyond history, about the human condition per se. The Foundation Year program, because of its very structure, right? It's structured through these periods from the ancient through the medieval, Renaissance, early modern periods up to the contemporary, tends towards, and in a way is structurally inhabiting what you could call, from at least the Straussian way would be to put this, would be a historicist framework, because it's reading the works as emerging through a history and a development, so that from the perspective of the Foundation Year program, standpoints become available in history which didn't belong to or were not really present in earlier ages. And so the questions of each era are not the same. There is not simply a set of permanent problems, a permanent human condition, that in fact that human condition has evolved and developed. So at that level, there's a fundamental tension, indeed opposition, between the way and shape of the Foundation program and the standpoint that Strauss embraces.
So that allows me to ask the next question, or actually not a question, simply a statement, because I've heard this come from you. We've talked about this repeatedly, and also I've heard you discuss your book in various contexts. And something I deeply admire about your work, which you've made clear, is that there's no point in writing a book like this on Leo Strauss if you're not going to be sympathetic to what he has to say. This is not a hatchet job, but an attempt to go deeply into his thinking and help others to understand what's important about it. So how difficult was it for you to write sympathetically about him?
Well, in a way, it wasn't difficult at all, because, as I've already mentioned, when I was a student here at King's in the early 1980s, I encountered a Straussian professor with whom I took a number of classes, an absolutely excellent teacher who was instructing his students in the arts and forms of thought that belong to the Straussian approach. But perhaps even more important to me was the encounter with George Grant, whom, if people haven't had a chance to read, I want to recommend his wonderful and lucid and short writings that were really fundamental to Canadian thought in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And George Grant gave very powerful testimony to the Straussian approach and made it a deeply compelling position. So I wrestled for much of my education with what seemed to me a very powerful position here about the nature of the contemporary world, a sense of, the nihilistic or the loss of meaning that seems to be inherent in that world, and Strauss's powerful explanation of where that came from and what remedies might be available for being liberated from that. For me, Strauss's position was one option of thinking that was part of the basic development of my education. And so in a sense, it was very easy to be sympathetic because I found it inherently compelling. Now, the result of my wrestling through that position is ultimately to be critical of that position and see it as, while powerful, nonetheless a limited and I would argue inadequate position in relationship to the fullness of the contemporary and the fullness of the tradition. But at the same time, one of the tragedies that's happened in relationship to Strauss scholarship and the reception of Strauss in the public domain and articles in the New Yorker and New York Times and so on is that Strauss has been the victim of a very oppositional and antagonistic set of accounts in which he's been demonized in all sorts of different ways. And the power of his thought has been considerably reduced. For me, one of the ways of recapturing that is, in a way, trying to get rid of the noise that surrounds the reception of Strauss and the political involvements of some of his students and some of the students of his students that have been ways in which Strauss has been reduced to a kind of agent in contemporary politics, and recover that sense in which he has really some fundamentally interesting and powerful philosophical insights and claims about what it means to live in our contemporary age.
Also, you have indicated, where we've talked about this before, that one way one can approach an author as gargantuan as Strauss is to proceed by consider whom the author is writing against, or what position the author is writing against. So what is Leo Strauss writing against?
So if one wants to have a sense of where Strauss is coming from, at the very heart of it, you have to place Strauss in the context in which his thought was fundamentally formed. So Leo Strauss was a German Jewish thinker, scholar, who was coming of age in the era of the Weimar Republic in Germany. And he powerfully experienced the inherent complexity of that German Jewish identity, in that very destabilizing context. The Weimar Republic was the political form that took shape in Germany from the end of the First World War to 1933 with the rise of Hitler. And so Strauss's thought is being fundamentally formed in that context. And as Strauss put it, the intellectual figure who dominates this period is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, died in 1900, but during his lifetime, his texts were not read or understood deeply, as you know. But in the beginnings of the 20th century, and especially during the Weimar Republic, Nietzsche becomes the inescapable figure for German intellectual life at this time. And Strauss's thought arises out of a confrontation and a thinking through of Nietzsche's position. As Strauss puts it, he was a Nietzschean from the age of 22 to the age of 30. And in that sense was embracing that standpoint. And it's only as he publishes his first book that he starts to emerge from that standpoint as sort of around the year 1929, 1930 to his own position. But it's been working through Nietzsche that he comes to this, and he comes to have an insight that in order to establish a position beyond what he is finding in Nietzsche, which he ultimately experiences as a form of nihilism. So Nietzsche recognizes the contemporary period as nihilistic and points to the possibility of a realm somehow beyond that, in a Übermensch or in an eternal return of the same, in a standpoint that takes us in some ways beyond the modern. But while Strauss accepts Nietzsche's characterization of the contemporary as nihilistic, he sees the willfulness and historical or the historical character of Nietzsche's vision, that it's a movement to something new, as all still caught up in the nihilism that it seeks to be free from. So what Strauss is trying to do, and he sees in a way, in the great figure that he encounters also as a young man in Martin Heidegger, another person who is also taking up a similar kind of sense of the contemporary as nihilistic, trying to point to a standpoint that moves us beyond that, but a standpoint that still embraces the human as fundamentally historical and temporal in character. And from Strauss's point of view, what happens to us as moral beings is that insofar as morality, as the way of life, is inherently made historical, is understood to be caught up in the character of time, we lose sight of the capacity for relationship to an abiding sense of what is significant, of what is morally significant, of how our life should be lived. And so ultimately, that leads to the emptiness of the moral life, the emptiness of the practical life, the emptiness of the political life. And so Strauss is trying to establish a position that has gone through Heidegger, has gone through Nietzsche, but is able to open up a position beyond them, and weirdly, by going before the modern period altogether. And that is his breakthrough. His breakthrough, the thing that happens to him in 1929, 1930, is he shifts away from a prejudice, as he puts it. And his prejudice was the belief that positions that belonged to the pre-modern world were no longer accessible or available or humanly livable. And his crucial move is to recover that sense that there is an abiding truth or validity that can be found in recovering that pre-modern standpoint. And that's what his turn to the ancients, to the Greeks, is fundamentally about. That by returning to Plato, by returning to the figure of Socrates, we can recover a position which is free of the willful historicist character that has made the modern world the age of nihilism that Strauss finds it to be.
So in that sense, for those of us who have trained in classics, even if partially, this is very inspiring, in other words, that there is a world that exists in the past that still speaks to us now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, so this is Strauss's sense of why the great books matter, why reading Plato and Xenophon and Aristotle and Thucydides are crucial works. As he says, we don't read them out of antiquarian concern. We read them out of a living need in the present, because what the present needs above all is to recover a standpoint that can take it beyond this crisis, this sense of emptiness. And so re-encounter a standpoint of nature, a standpoint of the eternal, by which the question of how a human life should be lived, which for Strauss is the fundamental question, how a human life should be lived, can be asked anew by being asked in the framework made available by these ancient texts. So it's exactly right. Reading Plato, in a sense, is the thing you need to do most of all in order to be able to inhabit the contemporary world without being subject simply to its nihilistic tendencies.
So that's also very powerful. And I should say, again, in the context of the 50th anniversary, that Plato has been read every single year. Mostly we've done it through his great work, The Republic, which also filters in very nicely with Leo Strauss, because it's clearly a work of political philosophy, in part at least, but identifiable as belonging to that tradition. So the confusing thing is, the way I've been tutoring Plato is misleading, or it is naive. Can you say something about that?
Okay, so this gets us to a really crucial question in Strauss. So Strauss wants us to go back to the pre-modern, and above all, focusing on the ancient Greeks, and especially the figure of Socrates, as opening for us what he calls classical political philosophy, as the space through which we can awaken this question of the best life, of the right life, in new terms, by recovering these old terms. But for Strauss, he in a way has accepted and imbibed the critique of metaphysics, which is at the heart of Nietzsche and Heidegger's critique of the Western tradition. The claim that there is a metaphysical realm of causes, of forms or ideas that are the source of the physical or material world that we inhabit. And so for both Nietzsche and for Heidegger, such claims, such metaphysical claims, are inherently life-denying and are in fact the deeper source of the nihilism that we are experiencing. And in a sense, Strauss accepts that critique, but he argues that that critique is premised on a misunderstanding of what's going on in those ancient works. And Strauss does a remarkable thing at this point. He argues that there is a hidden teaching in the entire tradition, but let's say specifically, there's a hidden teaching in Plato's Republic, which a reading that finds it a metaphysical text about the good and the ideas, the idea of justice and so on and so forth, understood as kind of metaphysical entities that cause the appearances of things. That kind of account, from Strauss's point of view, is an exoteric or a public presentation that Plato has put in place because of a fundamental problem, which I'll get to in a second. But instead, what the reader needs to get access to is this hidden or inner or esoteric teaching. And in order to get a hold of that, we have to read the text in a much more complex fashion, so that what it appears to say is only that exoteric teaching, and we need to read through various contradictions, hints, indications, this inner hidden teaching. But what is that all about? So this is one of the things that people find very strange about Strauss, and in fact, for many scholars, utterly ridiculous. That it may be the case that this figure, Voltaire or some, might have hidden teachings of various sorts because of persecution and so on. But this notion that there's this kind of systematic standpoint of esoteric teaching seems absurd to many scholars. From Strauss's point of view, that's simply a sign of the collapse of our own standpoint, because what we have lost sight of is a fundamental human dilemma. And the fundamental human dilemma for Strauss is captured by the notion that there is a basic opposition between the standpoint of philosophy and the standpoint of what he calls the city, the standpoint of a community or a society. What a community or society needs, its basic atmosphere in which it can exist, is the realm of opinion. And so any community, if it's going to be a sustainable community, needs to share some kind of beliefs, some kind of opinions about what is right and wrong, what is noble and what is ignoble, what the gods require and what the gods don't require. All of those things, that realm of opinion is crucial to the capacity of a city to survive. Philosophy is about the movement from opinion to knowledge. And as such, philosophy is inherently skeptical, or Strauss would put it, zetetic, of the standpoint of the city. And so at that level, philosophy is a poison for the city. And so Strauss will initially say that this hidden teaching is there because the city is going to persecute these philosophers. And again, this is why Socrates is the sort of archetypal philosophical figure, because of course Athens did in fact require Socrates to end his own life. And therefore Athens became aware of this fundamental opposition and needed to eliminate the philosopher from its midst. So the philosopher, in one sense, knows that there is something inherently to be persecuted about philosophy. But that's only one part of the motivation here. Further and deeper is the sense that the philosopher equally is protecting the city from the corrosive power of philosophy. And so for Strauss, there's a kind of crucial separation between the activity, the theoretical, zetetic, pursuit of knowledge aspect of philosophy, and the realm of practice and practical life, which belongs to the city. And what the esoteric, exoteric, the art of writing, as Strauss puts it, is preserving that difference so that these two sides do not conflate with one another. The character of the modern is, and its crucially destructive character, is that modern philosophy, based on a series of motivations, breaks down that separation. And in breaking down that separation, it creates a new thing, which is neither simply opinion, nor is it simply philosophy. It's the realm of what you could call ideology. That is to say, the turning of knowing into a form of practice, a world-changing form of knowing. And that world-changing form of knowing is what goes on in the era of the modern world as we try to make the world conform to our own human ends and purposes. And from Strauss's point of view, that turns out to be a self-destroying project, the project of modernity. And so the recovery of esotericism and exotericism isn't just a kind of weird technique, not just a weird historical point he's making. It's actually the recovery of the standpoint of what he calls classical political philosophy, which is the standpoint in which philosophy is aware of this fundamental tension with the life of the city.
So are you saying that Socrates, properly understood, is both a philosopher and aware of the dangers of doing philosophy?
Yes. But you might say it's even more Plato who has the experience of Socrates before him. I mean, Strauss does point out that Socrates only loses his life when he is 70. So he has been able to negotiate his work in the city. But Socrates is famous for being there in the agora, in the marketplace, where he can engage with the citizens and expose the inadequacy of all of their opinions. So he goes to a general and explains to a general that he doesn't know what courage is, or he goes to a priest and explains to a priest that he doesn't know what piety is. And over time, the citizens of Athens become annoyed at having their opinions undermined in this fashion. So you might say, but of course, Socrates never writes anything down. The crucial shift with Plato is the writing of philosophy so as to produce this inherently tension-filled text, which has the character of simultaneously publicly defending philosophy by saying what philosophy does, it's the source of the preservation, the theoretical grounding of what you believe in the city. So we will have an idea of justice that is the source of the justice in the city, and isn't that great? But in fact, what it teaches to those with deeper insight is the fundamentally problematic character of justice and the fundamentally problematic character of the standpoint of the city. And so Plato, in a way, has taken and learned the lesson of the dangers of the Socratic approach to this question and has resorted to this more hidden way of relating to the city.
So to continue on this line, the Republic of Plato can have a profound influence on people. Just in the first of 10 books, two things are established, I think, in a very profound way. The first is that justice can never harm anyone, which is that problematic for the city? The opinion is that justice should punish people, or what is the issue?
So in Strauss's view, the obvious reading of the text, the exoteric reading of the text, the metaphysical reading of the text, presents an argument which seems to seek to establish a realm in which philosophers can become kings, so that the idea of justice can be most perfectly embodied in the city. And so from that point of view, as you point out, justice harms no one, and therefore the realization of justice in the city is the reconciliation of everyone to that civic life and to the nature of things. Strauss's view is that the Republic, in fact, teaches the opposite of this, and that there is in a way no single justice. The justice of the philosopher, that is to say, that order in which the philosopher's well-being is most fully realized, is inherently in conflict with the justice that belongs to citizens. And so from Strauss's point of view, the whole point of the Republic is precisely to criticize the notion that we can bring theory, philosophy and practice together. The text needs to be read as fundamentally ironical in its character, so that its actual goal is to disrupt the claims that theory and practice can be brought together. And in that sense, you can read the Republic as, you know, in a sense, 2,000 years or 1,500 years before the time, already articulating the most basic critique of the project of modernity, which involves precisely the drawing together of philosophy and practice, of philosophers and kings, and that the view that you can make an enlightened society that will fulfill all human ends and aspirations and ensure that justice harms none. That sense of a reconciled humanism that is the nature of the modern project, and from Strauss's point of view, ultimately fails, has its deepest critique in principle already there in the Republic, rightly understood.
Well, the way you're describing it, if I could appeal to people who've probably read the Republic and FYP in response to the idea that justice can never harm anyone, Thrasymachus, the sophist, explodes by telling us that practical life cannot absorb such an absurd principle. So is this Strauss's position too?
Well, again, so Strauss sees the need to hold together both the position of Thrasymachus and the position of Socrates. And Strauss, therefore, pushes back against the characterization that the Thrasymachus position is simply a kind of straw man that gets destroyed in the course of the argument, and we can just put it aside as we move to this idealistic standpoint that Socrates opens us up to. So he wouldn't identify himself simply with the Thrasymachus position, but he thinks that the Thrasymachus position is a necessary corrective to the apparently idealizing character of what what Socrates is explicitly articulated.
So again, I have to apologize to everyone for giving a complete false account of this, but I'd like to say two things. The first is that Thrasymachus is silenced in the sense that there are 9 books following, and he's disappeared from the argument. Does that not enter into the consideration?
Well, again, in the Straussian standpoint, silence is meaningful.
I understand that in relation to music, in the sense that the silence.
And Socrates says that he and Thrasymachus have become friends at a certain stage in the argument. Because
Socrates has explained to Thrasymachus that no one can evade justice. When the project is a career or profession, there is a demand of justice puts upon you by the profession, in this case, the shepherd. But also he points out that in a den of thieves, without a just relationship one to another, whatever project, however evil you want to engage in, cannot be fulfilled. But okay, so based on what you're saying, we should move directly now to Machiavelli, because the one thing everybody knows about Strauss, who's heard the name, is everything goes to pieces. This great vision of a philosophical enterprise which understands it should not interfere with the city, all of that goes to pieces. It does it in Machiavelli.
Yeah, so in Strauss's view, the crucial turning point is the emergence of what he calls the modern project. And initially, Strauss had identified that with Thomas Hobbes, but then after that was in his period before he went to the United States, but then he comes to correct that and sees that Machiavelli is the crucial figure in bringing about this shift from that distinction between philosophy and the city to this well, not necessarily total unity, but interrelationship of philosophy and the city, which is the project of modernity. And so from Strauss's perspective, Machiavelli creates the vision that philosophy needs to be world changing in its character, and turns away from the notion that philosophy should be engaged in a theoretical standpoint that thinks about the nature of things, to a practical standpoint that seeks to alter that the world. Strauss calls this shift a lowering of horizons. And the notion here is that what the modern world is going to seek to do is lower our horizons. We're no longer seek to have that fullness of human virtue and excellence that is characteristic of ancient thought, and instead we're going to seek to turn thinking and acting towards what are, you might say, low but realizable ends and purposes. So from that point of view, politics is now going to aim at human well-being, fundamentally in a kind of, at least initially, a material or worldly sense. And this is animated in part by the desire to make philosophy practical, but it's also animated by what he calls a motivation of theological ire, that Machiavelli is responding to the ways in which the church over the period of time of the Middle Ages has arisen to become a kind of spiritual master over populations, and in doing so wreaking all manner of inhumane actions to realize its control over the lives of Western Europeans. And so Machiavelli is responding to this. There's this anti-theological ire, this desire, in a sense, to turn against the church. And from Strauss's point of view, he's very sympathetic to this anti-theological ire, but ultimately thinks that that is really the source of the problems of the modern world. Because from Strauss's point of view, he's got this very deep insight that you're defined by what you oppose. And this polemical, aggressive turn against religion, and specifically against Christianity, which Strauss sees to be characteristic of modernity, means that that modern world is weirdly inscribed by that Christian revelatory standpoint. And in doing so, is going to be moved by a desire to have the human replace the divine, or have the human replace the natural order. But in this Christian view, have the human replace the divine, so that the world can be made over for human ends and human purposes by human activities and human practices. And that is the birth of modern life as this exercise of transformation, which from Strauss's point of view is ultimately empty.
We need to bring things to a head or to a conclusion. So just let me ask one more question, which is, as you've explained it, isn't Leo Strauss teaching people to lower their horizons?
No, absolutely the opposite of that. Again, from his perspective, this is the only way to recover a sense of the ideal, a sense of higher ends and purposes within human life, by recovering the sense of nature, which allows us to recover a sense of human purposes. From Strauss's point of view, the modern world, by aiming at human fulfillment, reduces us all to, in a sense, desiring animals, and then by a series of waves, even the apparently given character of human desire, that we need to eat, that we need to have safety and security, that so on and so forth, those initial rights become historicize, and in doing so, they lose content until finally what Nietzsche reveals is what the modern world is simply the standpoint of a kind of irrational willing. And from that perspective, while Strauss developed his position before Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in 1933, he was developing it just like 3 years before that. Strauss would have found that move by Heidegger the greatest philosophical mind of the 20th century, of his era. Strauss had no doubt about that at all, embraced Nazism, and from Strauss's point of view, that was a perfectly natural position for Heidegger to take on, precisely because in Heidegger, you have the most complete evacuation, in Strauss's eyes, of the content of what is naturally right.
So I'd just like to remind you, when you're not a Straussian, that you have lectured frequently on Dante, and there is another stream of thought, which we'll embrace sometime in the future, perhaps, with you, which is that the city can be a place of reciprocity and exchange, and that's missing for me in what you've been describing.
Yes.
So can we just ask if anybody has an urgent question? We have a few minutes.
So if you're going to ask a question, you can do so by unmuting yourself and letting us know what you have to say.
Neil?
There's somebody there, yep.
Boris here.
Oh, yes.
Hi. Been a TC conference, exchange papers and discussions of papers. So great to see you again. I really enjoyed your talk. You did a great job laying out some of the basic insights of Strauss in such a short period of time. But I'm curious about your point that one of the fundamental premises of your Great Books program there at King's College
We seem to have trouble with
basically
the
historicists. So it makes me wonder, as thinkers of the 20th century. Which, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. So which of the great historicist thinkers of earlier times is the kind of informing intellect of the program? Is it R.G. Collingwood, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Heidegger? But more importantly, what I guess I'd like to hear from you is, as you know, Strauss critiqued all of these people in a very powerful way. What do you think is missing in his account of historicism, by virtue of which he missed out on something true or worthwhile about it, but that you can see more clearly than he did, because of which your program has adopted an essentially historicist approach to the Great Books program? In other words, how does Strauss's critique of historicism prove to be inadequate?
That's a great question. So again, the foundation year program doesn't have an explicit philosophical basis. In a way, there are a variety of people that teach in it, and a variety of people that were involved in founding it. I wouldn't want to ascribe any single standpoint to it. Some people have particularly mentioned Hegel as a crucial influence in this context.
Yeah, that's good too. Yeah,
but there are many people who teach in the foundation program comfortably with who would repudiate such a position, and some people that were fundamental to its foundations that would certainly repudiate such a position. So there's a kind of I'm just pointing out that the nature and structure of the program is periodized, and in that sense historically based, and it does assume some sense in which ideas or thoughts develop over time, and so we can't just leap over from one age to the next. So what would my critique be of Strauss's critique of historicism? One way of putting that is that Strauss sees historicism as ultimately leading to a nihilistic standpoint, which is to say that when human beings are reduced to human history, that history ultimately dissolves itself of all content. And when we become conscious of the work of history, we are left in an age of nihilism. What I would be wanting to argue, and in a way, this is what I was saying at the beginning, is that I think nihilism is a real aspect of the contemporary, but it's not the fullness of it. That there is another side to the contemporary, which is going on with this nihilism, which is, you might say, the side that Strauss finds empty, which is humanism, reconciliation, the capacity of human beings to find truth and goodness in human life. And so I think the deeper question, from my point of view, is the relationship of the fullness of the contemporary and the emptiness of the contemporary. I don't think it can be reduced to one side or the other. It's not simply, that we are now fully free beings and the world is there for our human fulfillment, nor is it that we're simply empty beings. I think the truth is the two sides together, which suggests that there might be an element to history which is non-historical, but is not reducible to history. But these are very deep questions.
Quick response. That sounds quite a bit like Hans-Georg Gadamer to me.
I'd have some considerable sympathy with Gadamer, but if I'm laying my cards on the table, Hegel would be my
okay.
Real go-to position.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
So in that spirit, having revealed all, I would like to encourage everyone to consider having a closer look at Neil's book if you haven't done so already. And it is a gargantuan project which has been realized relative to our gargantuan and influential figure. And things are laid out there with such care. It's quite mind-blowing how effective the work is and what it's done and what it says about us and FYP in its 50th year. So I think we'd like to thank everybody for coming, and we hope you've enjoyed the occasion.
Okay.
And please consider these questions relative to your own time in FYP. Thank you so much, Neil.
Thank you.